Hey YouTube, this is Ian from Big Rock ADV. So what we're going to do today is demystify BMW's riding modes and electronics. So this video is mostly going to apply to the later model BMW R1200GS and R1250GS, but a lot of the things that I talk about are also going to apply to older bikes from when they introduced the liquid-cooled bikes and added the electronics to them. And some of this stuff will also apply to the street models like the RT and others, but some of it won't, so just keep that in mind. BMW is really good at over-engineering things and also over-explaining things and making things really confusing in their owner's manuals, online, in their marketing materials. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down in a simple way, and you'll be able to ride your bike safer, faster, and you'll look like a pro. So let's jump in and get started. Okay, so why should you care about this? Well, there's a few good reasons that I could think of. One, you paid all the money to have one of these bikes, right? So you should use it to its full potential. Using these riding modes in the right way and using your electronics in the right way is going to make your ride safer. You're going to have more confidence in your abilities and the bike's abilities. And really, you're going to ride better when you learn how to master these settings. And you can impress your friends and look like a pro even if you aren't one. And I'm the perfect example of that. I'm not a pro rider, but I can look pretty good sometimes. But the electronics help me out with that. So there's like 5 main factors at play here that we're going to talk about. The 5 things are throttle response, which is how fast the throttle reacts to when you twist it, so it's going to affect the responsiveness feeling of the bike. Traction control. Traction control acts to reduce your wheel spin. ABS, which is anti-lock braking system, which reduces your skidding when you brake. And then there's 2 parts to the suspension settings we're going to talk about. The first part is the damping, or the hard, medium, soft that you might hear about. The second part is the ride height itself. So let's break down some of the terminology in a simple way. So a riding mode is simply a preset mode that has different settings for throttle response, traction control, ABS, and suspension settings. So it's like a pre-programmed setting that you can pull up on the dash real easy with a button right here and give you a certain amount of settings. So BMW configures these. You have like rain, road, enduro, dynamic, enduro pro, and so on. We're going to get into what those mean. Okay, when you hear ESA, ESA means electronically adjustable suspension. It just means that there are electronics that can control preload and damping in your suspension. It's as simple as that. You might hear dynamic ESA or dynamic ESA. What that means is the dynamic part is adding sensors in the bike that are sensing the motions going on with the bike, sensing the terrain, and adjusting the damping and the ride height as you ride. Okay, we know what ABS is, analog braking system, but what's ABS Pro? So you started to hear lately BMW has something called ABS Pro. So what is that? Well, the Pro basically means, and we'll get into this later, but it means that it has additional sensors that sense cornering, G-forces, different sensors in the bike that allow the ABS to work in a more advanced way to give you better control in corners and high G situations. So this is not the ABS of old that was just a sensor that sensed lockup. It's not like that. Okay, what about Asc and Dtc? So Asc was for a long time, and kind of still is, BMW's fancy German name for traction control. I think it means automatic stability control, something like that, but who really cares? It's just traction control. The Asc was something that senses the wheel slip and then cuts the throttle, cuts the power. Now Dtc is dynamic traction control. DTC, much like ABS Pro, so think of DTC to ASC as ABS Pro is to ABS. DTC is taking into consideration all the different sensors of the bike, and it's giving you a lot more adjustment also with the DTC, so you can configure it more. It's a much more advanced system and has huge advantages for off-road riding. Okay, you might hear about linked brakes or integrated brakes. Well, guess what? BMW and some other manufacturers, they like to put linked brakes on their bikes. And what it means is simply that when you squeeze the front brake lever, it applies some rear brake as well as the front brake. The ratio is like 70-30 or 80-20 or something like that, because you don't have much traction at the rear wheel when the motorcycle is braking. So they've had linked brakes on the GS at least, I think since 2005 when that generation GS came out. Okay, what about the coating plug or the Enduro Pro Plug, or the little thing that's under the seat that your dealer may have showed you or you may have heard about? What the heck is that? So basically it's just a jumper plug. It's just a simple jumper that plugs in to a wire under the seat. And when you plug that in, your dynamic and your Enduro modes become Dynamic Pro and Enduro Pro. The Pro modes have different default settings than the standard modes. They're more aggressive, they're for more advanced rider. But most importantly, what the Pro modes allow compared to their standard counterparts is more adjustability to those settings. The other thing that is nice about those Pro modes is that once you set the bike in that mode, even if you turn the bike back and back on, if you have the jumper in, the mode stays in what you left it, which I love. The moral of the story with the plug is that just plug it in your bike and leave it. And we're going to talk about why that is. And it has to do with setting up the modes how you want them and then leaving them. There's no disadvantage to having the plug-in. So you might hear Ride Modes Pro, right? When you look at the spec sheet of some of these bikes. Well, as you know, most BMWs come loaded with options. You hardly ever see the base motorcycles at all. Ride Modes Pro just means that you get all the additional riding modes. If you didn't have it, if you did have one of those rare unicorn base bikes, you wouldn't have like Enduro and Enduro Pro and Dynamic and all that kind of stuff. You'd probably just have Road and Rain, but I've never seen a GS that was like that. They have something called e-gas. Well, that's just a kind of dumb way of saying electronic throttle, or throttle by wire is the more common term that you're going to hear. It's the same thing. What about RDC? Now, you may have heard that or seen it up on your screen on your bike. RDC is some German thing for tire pressure monitoring. They're starting to kind of refer to that as TPM, which is the more universally accepted acronym for tire pressure monitoring and tire pressure monitoring system. But if you see RDC, it's just the tire pressure monitor. So a few notes before we jump into the riding modes and how all these settings work. In any mode you're in, there's two things you can always control independently of the mode. You can always turn ABS off on the dash here to do that. You can also turn off Asc or Dtc, which is basically traction control. So by holding down the ABS button on your dash, you can cycle and turn one or the other or both of those systems off, regardless of what riding mode you're in. And when you do deactivate those systems, you're going to get lights on the dash lighting up saying that they're deactivated. Now, the electronics have not always been the same over the different generations of bikes, and they keep adding more stuff over the years. So here's what you need to know. In 2013, when the water-cooled GS came out, they introduced a whole new slew. They had the riding modes, the electronic throttle, the cruise control, all these sorts of things. They didn't have that on the oilhead bikes. Now, the GS between 05 and 12 did have the stability control, the rudimentary traction control, and it had the rudimentary ABS, which you just had to switch completely off for any sort of off-roading because it was just dangerous. Also on the 05 to 12 bikes, they had ESA, but it was not dynamic ESA. So you didn't have the sensors and adjusting as you ride. You could just set like the ride height and the damping firmness. Now, okay, so the 2013 to 2016 bikes, what I call kind of the Gen 1 of the water-cooled bikes, you didn't have dynamic traction control, you had ASC, so you didn't have the sensors like the leaning sensors and all the cool stuff like that. You didn't have ABS Pro, you had it. Okay, so we're gonna get into the heart of this. Now, I'm gonna try to keep this simple as I can. This is kind of a complex topic, there's a lot going on here, but I'm gonna try to make it as easy as I can. So really, there are 6 riding modes that are technically available to you on a GS such as this one. Those 6 modes are Road, Rain, Dynamic, Enduro, and then you've got Dynamic Pro and Enduro Pro. Now, like I talked about, when you put in the coating plug, Dynamic Pro and Enduro Pro replace Dynamic and Enduro. So in reality, you only can access 4 modes at any given time, depending on whether you have to plug in or not. But like I said earlier, just put the plug in, and we're going to talk about how to set it up for you. There's one thing that I kind of forgot to mention earlier. The bike does have anti-wheelie settings, so because it's got the motion sensors on the bike, it can sense when the front is coming up off the ground. So the different modes and the different settings will affect how much anti-wheelie the bike has. So your bike, when you get it from the dealer or the way most people ride it, it's usually in road mode. You're on the road, you're using road mode. Okay, that makes sense. So what BMW did with the road mode is that they kind of have everything right down the middle, pretty safe, pretty responsive, you know, suspension kind of in a medium setting, and everything is just good. It just works well, and it's safe. So you have, you know, a nice normal progressive throttle response. You have normal ABS settings. ABS Pro is active. Your DTC for your traction control is set at a normal setting, so it's going to allow a little bit of wheel slip, but not very much. And going back to the ABS Pro, it's going to allow just a little tiny bit of skidding, but hardly any, because in a road you don't really want much of that. It's going to have a lot of wheelie intervention in the road mode. You have two damping choices on your suspension button here when you're in road mode. You can go standard or dynamic. So what that allows you to do is that even though you're in the road riding mode, you can put the suspension to firm, or to dynamic, I should say. And I like to do that a lot. The twisty roads where I live, I usually ride in road mode myself on the highway, but I switch the suspension in a dynamic and it firms the damping up. I find it better for carving the canyons. Now, in all the modes, because the newer bikes, we're going to be talking about the dynamic ESA, and on the 2017 and later bikes on the 1250s, you have 3 modes for the ride height. So you set the ride height by holding down the suspension button. So there's low, which basically lowers the rear end of the bike as low as it can. Now keep in mind, the ride height does not affect the front. So even though the front is a monoshock and it is dynamic ESA, for whatever reason, they don't raise and lower the front, they just do everything at the back. You've got the auto setting. What the auto setting does is when you get on the bike and you load your bike with your gear, your wife, or whatever it is, it senses that and it puts the bike at the height that it should be for optimal suspension dynamics. And then you've got the high mode. The high mode is used when you want maximum ground clearance for things like off-roading or things like that. Now, but let me let you in on a secret. I just leave it in auto all the time. I played around with it because it's kind of cool to watch the bike go up and down, and it is noticeable up and down. The low setting might be useful for those of you who are newer to riding, or maybe you're going off-road for the first time and you want to be closer to the ground. Put it in low. It's awesome to have that adjustability. Okay, so rain mode is what it sounds like. It's what you would expect. What they do in rain mode is they soften everything up and make it safer for slippery roads. So your throttle response is slower, so when you turn the throttle, you get less response. Your ABS is more intervention on the ABS, so it's going to intervene sooner. It's going to be more sensitive. ABS Pro is still active on that. DTC is going to be in a heightened state of sensitivity, so it's going to be watching more for any slippage and intervening faster because it's assuming the road's more slippery. Your anti-wheelie is still going to be very sensitive, and you still have 2 damping choices on your dynamic ESA, which is the road or standard, as I call it, and then dynamic. And you still have the same ride height settings in all the modes. Okay, so dynamic mode is basically like your sport mode, if you want to think of it that way. What dynamic mode does, it adjusts a whole slew of things to make the bike feel sportier. So I think the most noticeable thing that happens in dynamic is your throttle response is much more aggressive. You turn the throttle a little bit, you get a lot of acceleration. So it feels faster, it feels more athletic, but the bike's not any faster. You get the same horsepower, you get the same torque, you have the same performance, but it just means that you only have to use the throttle a little bit to go really fast. So it just feels different. Also, the ABS, there's an error on my little sheet here, so I apologize for that, but the ABS is a little bit less active than normal. It's going to intervene a little bit later. It's going to allow you in this dynamic mode a little bit more slippage, a little bit more backing into corners, things like that on the road. Your traction control, your DTC or your ASC, if you have an ASC bike, is going to be less intervention, so it's going to let you have a little bit more fun, a little bit more slipping before it intervenes, but it's still going to catch you. Your anti-wheelie is going to be in a lower state, so basically it's going to let you lift the front wheel a little bit more in dynamic, which is kind of fun. It's not going to just cut the power right away when you try to wheelie. Okay, so getting into the Enduro modes. So assuming you don't put the plug in, you've got the dynamic and the Enduro. So in the Enduro mode without the plug, throttle response is going to be normal. ABS is going to be less intrusive because it knows you're on dirt, but it's assuming that you are using street type tires. That's the thing about Enduro mode that I want to say, is that Enduro versus Enduro Pro, it's kind of set up where Enduro is more for street tires and a more street oriented rider, and Enduro Pro is pre-programmed to be for like knobby tires and more aggressive off-roading. So you still have ABS active in Enduro mode, even on the back. ABS Pro is only somewhat active in Enduro, so what the manual says, it's kind of confusing. It says that it's trying to sense the cornering and the G-forces and things like that, but it might not always be able to, which is kind of confusing. DTC or traction control in Enduro is it doesn't let you have much slip at all, more so than it does on the road, but it's still very little slip. So it's a safe setting for having, again, like a street type tire when you're riding in the dirt. Your anti-wheelie setting is down a little bit more, so it does let you, get a little bit more wheelie. It softens the damping. When you go into the Enduro modes, it softens the damping. It's assuming that because you're going over bumps and things, it needs to give you more absorption and absorb roots and rocks and things like that a little bit better. Okay, so let's talk about the Pro modes. So like we talked about, you got to put the plug in to access the Pro modes. Now, I recommend that you simply put the plug in and just have that always in. And the reason is that you can set up the Pro modes however you like. So for instance, if you want Enduro Pro to match the settings of Enduro, you can do that by dialing back the throttle and the traction control, the ABS, to the standard settings of the Enduro mode. Now, your manual will tell you exactly how to do this. It's pretty easy. It'll also give you the standard settings for all these modes. But let's assume you're not going to configure it. You're not going to go in there and configure it how you want. What do Dynamic Pro and Enduro Pro default to? Okay, so Dynamic Pro is going to give you that fast turn throttle. ABS is going to be less active than in the road mode. Basically, I don't have to go through this because it's going to be the same as Dynamic, but the difference is that it's going to be a little bit more aggressive. And the other difference is when you turn the bike off and on, it's going to stay in that mode for you with that Pro mode activated, so that's nice. Now, Enduro Pro is where you get into the big difference. There's a big difference in the default setting between Enduro Pro and Enduro. And they do this so that you can simply, plug the thing in and then take off with the knobby tires, and pretty much is set up pretty well. So in Enduro Pro, the default mode is the throttle to be in the normal or kind of the road setting. So it's not the fast turn, but it's also not the rain mode. But you can customize that if you want. In Enduro Pro mode, the ABS is much different. You lose the ABS Pro, so you're not having the special sensors. But what it does do in Enduro Pro is it turns off the rear wheel ABS completely. So when you use the rear brake, just be prepared. It's going to lock up and slide. There's no intervention on the back. But the front is still active. Now, I really like this setting, and a lot of adventure bikes have this, obviously. It's great because I don't ever want my front wheel to lock up on a 550-pound bike, but I do want to be able to steer with my rear wheel. The other big difference on the default Enduro Pro setting is your DTC or your ASC, your traction control intervention, is much less. So it's going to let you slide the back end around quite a bit with the throttle before it catches you. Now, it's still there, it's still active, so it's kind of fun because you can pretty much nail the throttle and drift through corners. It's not going to let you step out too far. You could still crash. I mean, don't think that it's a total insurance policy against stupidity, because it isn't. You could still wreck, but it gives you quite a bit before it intervenes. The anti-wheelie function is disabled in Enduro Pro mode, so it's not trying to adjust for your wheelies or lifting the front end. So that's turned off, and your damping is in that softer off-road mode. So in Enduro Pro, you can change the throttle response, you can change the traction control, and you can change the ABS. So they give you 3 features you can set up for how you like. The nice thing is it programs those settings and it remembers them. And like I said, when you cycle the power on the bike, it stays in that mode. So some people might want to set up Enduro Pro with the rain throttle response or the softer throttle response because maybe you feel that's more controllable, and you could do that. Now, you could have the rain throttle or the soft throttle, but you could still have Enduro Pro DTC. So if you want a softer throttle, but you still want the bike to be able to throttle steer, you can do that because you can leave DTC in Enduro Pro mode and throttle response and whatever you want. So you see, you can make a lot of different combinations here. So you've got the 3 throttle response choices, you've got the 2 traction control choices. Enduro is less slip, Enduro Pro is much more slip. And ABS, you can have Enduro, which is active on both wheels, or you can have Enduro Pro, which again turns the ABS off to the back. So what you'll notice is that, like I said, there's no reason to not have the plug-in, because if you want the softer settings of Enduro, the more safe settings of Enduro, you can just program that as your Enduro Pro mode, and then that's what Enduro Pro is. Dynamic Pro customization, you can change the throttle response and the DTC, but you don't have any choice on the ABS. They're not letting you turn off ABS on the dynamic road mode. So trying to sort of get towards some conclusions here and make sense of this. Basically the factory settings with the plug-in I think are going to make sense for a lot of people. You're going to have the nice rain mode, the nice road mode for most of your riding. You're going to have dynamic when you really want to feel sporty. And then you've got Enduro Pro, which is great for, I think, probably the average GS rider will like Enduro Pro, especially with a set of semi-knobby or dual sport tires. Experiment and see what works for you. You know, really go out and play with these things and see what you prefer. Don't be afraid to use this. Another thing that you want to think about is when you do ride in the dirt, please use Enduro or Enduro Pro. And I really encourage you to use Enduro Pro because ABS can be pretty dangerous off-road sometimes. You know, if you come up off-road and need to stop really quick and the ABS is in the road mode, you've got the bike set up in road, it's not going to let you stop very well. So make sure you're engaging those Enduro modes when you're in the dirt or the gravel. Gravel especially is dangerous when you have ABS on. One bonus thing that I want to talk about is the tire pressure. So a few things on that. The bike has RDC or TPM or whatever, the tire pressure monitoring, and it uses sensors in the wheels to sense the pressure. Now, when you go to Enduro or Enduro Pro mode, the tire pressure warning is disabled automatically by the computer. What that means is that if you reduce your tire settings for off-road, which would make sense for riding off-road, and we'll have another video on that, but then it turns off the warning kind of flashing stuff on the dash for that, which I think is a great idea because I don't want my computer beeping at me and flashing at me just because I lowered my tire pressure in the dirt. Now, when you go back on the street and go back into your street modes, it is going to give you that tire pressure warning, which is kind of a nice reminder that you need to pump up your tires back up. So going a little bit more deeply into the tire pressure, I think it's important to talk about this. So a lot of people don't understand this. So like I said, the sensors are in the wheels. They measure, actually, they don't just measure pressure though, they also measure the temperature. And the reason that they measure the temperature is because they're normalizing the pressure for 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the reason that they're doing that is because pressure and temperature are dependent on each other. So higher temperature raises the pressure. So they have to normalize it to a certain temperature because if you think about any car, any motorcycle, they give you a tire pressure specification, but that goes up and down depending on the temperature. So you kind of have to pick where you want to set it at. So they've decided, okay, we're going to use 68 degrees as our baseline, and that's what we're going to do. Now, what you notice is if you use a tire gauge to check the pressure on your BMW, it's usually not going to match what it says on the computer. Now, when I first got my bike, I was like, gosh, this is off by a few pounds. Well, it's compensating for the temperature. So a few gripes I have with the BMW electronics. They're pretty good overall, but the biggest thing for me, and I'm sure they'll do this when they redesign the GS or evolve it again, is they need to have more modes for the traction control. So what I mean is that they really only have two settings for riding off-road with the traction control. They have the Enduro and they have Enduro Pro. Enduro basically is like no slip, and then Enduro Pro is quite a bit, but there's nothing in between. A lot of modern adventure bikes have like a 1 through 7 or 1 through 9 setting that allows you to really dial in how much rear wheel slip out you want. I love that, and I wish the GS would have it. So I sincerely hope that this video has been helpful for you in understanding and decoding how the electronics on your GS work or any BMW that you might have. Let me know what you found, what settings you like in the electronics, and any sort of weird quirks or interesting things that you found after owning a GS. The best thing about the GS community, or the adventure community in general, is we share knowledge and we learn from each other, and we're willing to change our mind based on new information. So let's keep it going, let's keep a good thing going, and if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do so. We're going to have a lot more videos on GS and other adventure bikes as well. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Until then, ride safe. We'll see you out on the trail, and see you next time.